Elias Thorne, a quiet 17-year-old, had mastered the art of blending into the background at Crestwood Academy. His slender build, a perpetually downcast gaze, and a mop of dark hair that often obscured his eyes, allowed him to drift through the bustling corridors like a wisp of smoke. His worn canvas shoes barely scuffed the polished floors, and his faded satchel hung loosely as he navigated the labyrinth of lockers and boisterous student groups. Elias had arrived at Crestwood just 3 months prior, a consequence of his mother's new position at the city hospital. Starting senior year in an unfamiliar environment was challenging enough, but Elias carried additional burdens that made him an easy target. His clothes were hand-me-downs, his lunch often a meager collection of leftovers, and his reserved nature was perceived as weakness by those who thrived on intimidation. The first time Rex Kincaid truly noticed Elias was in the sprawling cafeteria during the second week of term. Rex, a towering figure honed by years on the football field with meticulously styled blonde hair and designer apparel, commanded his social circle with an iron will. His loyal entourage hung on his every word, eager participants in his cruel amusements. "Check out the new ghost," Rex had murmured to his cronies, gesturing subtly towards Elias, who sat alone at a secluded table, quietly unwrapping a simple sandwich. "Bet he's never even looked a girl in the eye." Brick Jensen, Rex's burly second-in-command, chuckled, adjusting the collar of his Letterman jacket. With his imposing physique and a perpetual sneer, Brick was the group's enforcer, always ready to escalate a verbal jab into a physical confrontation. "Looks like he'd crumble if you breathed on him. Probably never thrown a punch." The third member, Silas Croft, was smaller, but compensated with a chilling ingenuity in his torment. His dark hair was slicked back, and his eyes held a calculating glint that unsettled even some of the faculty. "We should give our new arrival a proper welcome," Silas suggested, a predatory grin spreading across his face. Their initial overtures were subtle. Deliberate bumps in the hallways, snide remarks just loud enough to be overheard, and a pervasive sense of unwelcomeness wherever Elias went. He endured it all in silence, keeping his head down and moving between classes. He had learned long ago that resistance only invited more aggression, and he harbored secrets that demanded he remain unnoticed. What none of them knew was that Elias hailed from a lineage touched by the extraordinary. His grandmother, Ilara, had possessed latent psychokinetic abilities, a gift she had meticulously concealed throughout her life. His mother, Anya, occasionally exhibited fleeting bursts of similar power during moments of intense emotional strain. Elias himself had always felt a peculiar resonance, a strange energy stirring within him when his feelings ran high. But he had diligently suppressed these sensations after a terrifying childhood incident that had deeply frightened his family. The harassment intensified over the ensuing weeks. In the gymnasium, Rex would accidentally collide with Elias during dodgeball, sending him sprawling across the polished floor to the amusement of other students. In the crowded corridors, Brick would deliberately shoulder-check him into lockers, scattering his books and forcing him to scramble before the next bell. Silas specialized in psychological warfare, fabricating rumors about Elias's family's financial struggles and ensuring everyone knew about his second-hand wardrobe. Ms. Albright, Elias's literature teacher, observed the escalating signs, but felt helpless without concrete evidence. She watched as Elias retreated further into himself, his participation in class discussions dwindling to nothing. Other teachers often turned a blind eye to the obvious torment, either too preoccupied with their own duties or unwilling to confront the popular students whose affluent parents were generous school benefactors. The breaking point arrived on a crisp Tuesday afternoon in late October. Elias had lingered after school to use the library's computer for a research project, knowing his family couldn't afford internet access at home. As he walked through the deserted hallways towards the exit, he heard footsteps echoing behind him. His stomach clenched as he recognized the familiar voices. Rex, Brick, and Silas were following him. "Hey, Thorn!" Rex's voice boomed, reverberating off the lockers. "What's the rush, little man?" Elias quickened his pace, but the trio easily caught up to him near a side exit. The corridor was empty, most students and staff having departed for the day. Emergency lights cast long, distorted shadows, creating an atmosphere of chilling isolation. "We've been watching you, freak," Brick sneered, blocking Elias's path to the door. "Always slinking around, acting like you're too good for everyone." "I just want to go home," Elias murmured, his voice barely a whisper. He felt a familiar tremor deep within him, a strange electricity that made his fingertips tingle. He forced it down, just as he'd been taught since childhood. Silas stepped closer, his cold eyes gleaming with malicious intent. "That's not how this works. You see, you've been disrespectful by ignoring us, and that's simply unacceptable." Rex cracked his knuckles menacingly. "We tried to be friendly, to welcome you to our school, but you just kept walking away. That was rude." Elias backed against the lockers, trapped between the three boys and the unyielding metal. His heart pounded as he felt the familiar pressure building behind his eyes, the same sensation he'd experienced as a child when his emotions spiraled out of control. He closed his eyes, concentrating on maintaining his composure, on keeping the strange energy locked away where it couldn't harm anyone. "Look at him," Brick scoffed, misinterpreting Elias's closed eyes as abject fear. "I think he's about to cry." "Perhaps he needs a real reason to shed some tears," Silas suggested, reaching into his backpack. What he produced made Elias's blood run cold, a sleek black device with twin metal prongs that sparked with a menacing blue light. "Where did you get that?" Rex asked, a flicker of impressed surprise in his eyes. "My dad's a security consultant. He won't miss it," Silas replied, pressing a button that made the stun gun crackle ominously. "I've been itching to try this out." Elias's eyes snapped open wide with terror. "Please don't. I won't tell anyone, I promise. Just let me go home." "Too late for that," Rex said, seizing Elias by the shoulders. "Hold him still, Brick." Brick gripped Elias's arms while Rex pinned him against the lockers. Elias struggled desperately, but he was no match for their combined strength. The pressure inside his head intensified, accompanied by a strange humming sensation that seemed to vibrate through his entire body. "This is going to be fun," Silas said, advancing with the stun gun raised. "I wonder how loud you'll scream." "Stop, please," Elias begged, but his pleas only seemed to fuel their cruelty. Silas pressed the device against Elias's side and pulled the trigger. 50,000 volts of electricity surged through Elias's body, causing him to convulse violently against the lockers. But instead of the expected screams of agony, something entirely unforeseen occurred. The electric shock didn't just course through Elias. It seemed to ignite something that had lain dormant within him for years. The carefully controlled energy he'd spent a lifetime suppressing suddenly erupted outward like a dam bursting. Every light fixture in the hallway shattered simultaneously, raining glass down on the four boys. The metal lockers began to vibrate and groan, their doors flying open with thunderous crashes. Rex and Brick released Elias in stunned disbelief, stumbling backward as the floor beneath their feet began to tremble. Elias stood against the lockers, no longer the terrified victim, but something far more formidable. His eyes had transformed, glowing with an ethereal azure light, and the air around him seemed to shimmer with an invisible force. "What the—" Rex began, but his words were cut short as an unseen power lifted him off his feet and slammed him against the opposite wall. He slid to the floor, gasping for breath, staring at Elias in utter bewilderment. Brick tried to flee, but the heavy exit door slammed shut before he could reach it. He tugged frantically at the handle, but it wouldn't budge, as if welded in place. Behind him, the sound of groaning metal filled the air as the lockers continued to bend and warp under the influence of Elias's unleashed power. Silas still clutched the stun gun, but his hands were trembling as he watched his friends being tossed around by an invisible force. "This isn't possible," he whispered, backing away from Elias. "This can't be real." Elias took a step forward, and with each movement, the intensity of the supernatural energy increased. Ceiling tiles began to fall around them, and the fluorescent light fixtures swayed precariously overhead. His voice, when he finally spoke, carried a resonance that seemed to emanate from the very core of the earth itself. "You wanted to see me break," Elias said, his words echoing unnaturally in the damaged hallway. "You wanted to see me scared and helpless." Brick was pressed against the locked door, tears streaming down his face as he felt an incredible pressure squeezing him from all sides. "Elias, please, we're sorry, we didn't mean it." Rex struggled to stand, using the wall for support, but invisible hands kept pushing him back down. His expensive clothes were torn, and blood trickled from a cut on his forehead where he'd hit the concrete blocks. "This is impossible. People can't do this." "You're right," Elias replied, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Normal people can't do this, but you just discovered that I'm not normal." Silas made a desperate attempt to use the stun gun again, lunging forward with the device extended, but it flew from his hands before he could make contact. The stun gun sailed through the air and embedded itself in the drywall 20 feet away, its plastic casing cracking from the impact. Elias raised his hand, and all three boys were lifted simultaneously into the air. They floated helplessly, their feet dangling several feet off the ground, held in place by the sheer force of his will. The fear in their eyes was absolute now. The same terror they had inflicted on others for years reflected back at them 100-fold. "For months, you've made my life a living hell," Elias continued, his voice steady despite the incredible power flowing through him. "You've humiliated me, hurt me, and made me dread coming to school every single day." "We'll stop," Rex pleaded, his voice cracking with desperation. "We'll leave you alone. We'll never bother you again." "You'll do more than that," Elias said, lowering them until their feet touched the ground, but keeping them pinned against the wall with invisible force. "You're going to understand what it feels like to be powerless." One by one, Elias began to demonstrate the extent of his abilities. Brick's expensive sneakers were ripped from his feet and twisted into unrecognizable shapes. Silas's meticulously styled hair was mussed by invisible hands, leaving him looking disheveled and vulnerable. Rex's Letterman jacket was stripped away and shredded, the pieces scattered across the debris-covered floor. But Elias didn't stop with their possessions. Using his psychokinetic powers with surgical precision, he began to give them a taste of the physical intimidation they had dished out for so long. Rex found himself being lifted and spun in dizzying circles until he was nauseous. Brick was pressed against the lockers with the same force they had used to pin Elias, feeling metal edges dig into his back. Silas was lifted high into the air and held there, experiencing the vertigo and helplessness of being completely at someone else's mercy. "Please stop," Silas whimpered, suspended near the ceiling and looking down at the destruction below. "I'm going to be sick." "Now you know how I felt every single day," Elias replied. But there was no malice in his voice anymore, only a cold, calculated justice. "The difference is, I'm not a monster like you." He gently lowered Silas to the ground. Though he kept all three boys restrained against the wall, the supernatural energy around Elias began to subside slightly, the azure glow in his eyes dimming to a more normal intensity. The rumbling in the building stopped, and the remaining intact lights flickered back to a steady glow. "Here's what's going to happen," Elias announced, his voice returning to its normal tone but carrying an authority that hadn't been there before. "You're going to tell everyone at school exactly what happened here tonight. You're going to admit that you've been bullying me and that I defended myself." No way, Rex protested weakly. No one will believe this crazy story anyway. Elias smiled for the first time in months, but it wasn't a kind expression. With a subtle gesture, he caused one of the destroyed lockers to crumple further, the metal screaming in protest. Do you really want to test me on that? Rex's defiance crumbled instantly. Okay. We'll tell them whatever you want. I want you to tell them the truth, Elias corrected, that you three have been terrorizing an innocent student, and that when you escalated to using a weapon on me, you discovered that some fights aren't worth picking. Brick, still pressed against the wall, nodded frantically. Yes, we'll tell everyone. We'll make sure they know we were wrong. And you'll make sure no one else gets bullied in this school, Elias continued, the invisible force holding them beginning to ease slightly. You'll use your influence to protect other students instead of hurting them. Silas, back on solid ground, but still unable to move freely, looked around at the destruction surrounding them. Broken glass, twisted metal, fallen ceiling tiles, and damaged walls bore testament to the incredible power that had been unleashed. How is this even possible? How long have you been able to do this? Elias considered the question, remembering years of suppressing his abilities, of living in fear of what he might accidentally do if he lost control. I've always been different. My family taught me to hide it, to never let anyone know what I could do. But you three decided to bring weapons into this, and that changed everything. The realization of what they had awakened began to sink in. Rex looked around at the demolished hallway, understanding that this level of destruction could have been turned on them personally if Elias had chosen to be truly vindictive. We could have been killed, he whispered. Yes, Elias agreed simply, but I'm not you. I don't enjoy hurting people who can't defend themselves. Slowly, Elias released his psychokinetic hold on the three boys. They slumped against the wall, their legs shaky from the adrenaline and terror of the past several minutes. None of them made any attempt to run or continue their attack. The fight had been completely taken out of them. Go home, Elias instructed, shouldering his satchel. Think about what happened here tonight. Think about all the other students you've hurt over the years. And tomorrow, you start making it right. As Elias walked toward the exit door, it swung open for him without any visible mechanism. He paused in the doorway and looked back at his former tormentors, who were still staring at him in amazement and fear. And if you ever touch another student the way you touched me, he added quietly, remember what you've seen here tonight. Because next time, I might not be so merciful. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving Rex, Brick, and Silas alone in the destroyed hallway. For several minutes, none of them spoke, each processing what they had witnessed and experienced. The silence was broken only by the occasional sound of settling debris and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system. Word of the incident spread through Crestwood Academy like wildfire over the next few days, though the story changed with each telling. Some students claimed there had been an electrical malfunction that caused widespread damage to the East Wing. Others whispered about a fight that had gotten out of hand, resulting in property destruction and injuries. But Rex, Brick, and Silas kept their promise to Elias. In a surprising turn of events, they called an assembly where they publicly admitted to months of bullying behavior and formally apologized not just to Elias, but to several other students they had targeted over the years. Their confession shocked the student body and faculty, many of whom had suspected the bullying, but had never seen the three popular students take responsibility for their actions. The damaged hallway was quickly repaired over the weekend, with the administration attributing the destruction to an electrical surge caused by aging wiring. No questions were asked about how such a surge could have caused lockers to bend and twist into impossible shapes, or why the damage seemed to radiate outward from one specific location. Elias noticed the change in atmosphere immediately. Students who had previously ignored him now nodded respectfully in the hallways. Teachers smiled at him more often and seemed genuinely interested in his academic progress. Even students he'd never spoken to began including him in conversations and inviting him to sit with them at lunch. The transformation in Rex, Brick, and Silas was perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the entire situation. Stripped of their cruel swagger and forced to confront the consequences of their actions, they began to genuinely reform their behavior. Rex started using his natural leadership abilities to organize anti-bullying initiatives. Brick channeled his protective instincts into defending younger students who were being picked on. Even Silas, with his sharp intelligence, began tutoring struggling classmates instead of finding new ways to torment them. 6 weeks after the incident, Elias was walking to his car after school when Rex approached him alone. The former bully looked nervous but determined, his hands shoved deep in his pockets as he struggled to find the right words. "Elias," Rex began hesitantly, "I know we already apologized publicly, but I wanted to talk to you privately too." Elias paused, his keys in his hand, and studied Rex's face for any sign of the old hostility. What he saw instead was genuine remorse and something that might have been respect. "What did you want to say?" Elias asked, his voice neutral but not unfriendly. Rex took a deep breath before continuing. "I wanted you to know that what happened that night, it changed everything for me, not just because of what you could do, but because of what you chose not to do." Elias waited silently for him to continue. "You could have really hurt us," Rex went on, his voice growing stronger with conviction. "With that kind of power, you could have put us in the hospital or worse. But you didn't. You taught us a lesson instead of just getting revenge, and that says something about who you are as a person." "Everyone deserves a chance to be better than they were," Elias replied simply. Rex nodded, a small smile crossing his face. "Brick, Silas, and I have been talking about that a lot lately. We wasted so many years being awful to people who didn't deserve it. We can't take that back, but we can try to do better going forward." The two young men stood in comfortable silence for a moment, both reflecting on how dramatically their relationship had changed. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the nearly empty parking lot, and somewhere in the distance, the sounds of after-school activities drifted on the autumn breeze. "For what it's worth," Rex added, "I'm glad you're at our school now. Things are better with you here." As Elias drove home that afternoon, he reflected on the strange turns his life had taken. For 17 years, he had lived in fear of his abilities, convinced that they made him dangerous and different in ways that would never be accepted. His family had taught him to suppress his gifts, to hide them from a world that wouldn't understand. But the confrontation with his bullies had taught him something important about power and responsibility. His psychokinetic abilities weren't just a burden to be hidden. They were a part of who he was, and like any tool, their morality depended entirely on how they were used. The incident had forced him to make a choice about what kind of person he wanted to be. He could have used his powers for revenge, to become a bully himself with supernatural abilities that no one could resist. Instead, he had chosen to use them as a teaching tool, to create understanding rather than just fear. Elias realized that the real victory hadn't been demonstrating his hidden strength. It had been showing mercy when he could have chosen violence. By refusing to become the monster his tormentors had tried to make him, he had not only freed himself from their persecution, but had actually helped them become better people. As he pulled into his driveway, Elias made a silent promise to himself. He would never again hide from who he was or apologize for the gifts he had been given. But he would also never use those gifts to harm innocent people or to gain unfair advantages over others. Walking into his house, Elias found his mother waiting for him in the kitchen, her eyes filled with concern and knowing. She had sensed the change in him, the way the suppressed energy that had always surrounded him had finally found balance and purpose. "Something happened today," she said, not quite a question. Elias sat down across from her and for the first time in his life told his mother everything about his abilities and what had transpired at school. He watched as relief washed over her face, relief that her son had finally found the courage to be himself, and that he had chosen to use his power wisely. The days that followed brought a new normal to Crestwood Academy. Elias continued to excel academically, but now he participated more actively in class discussions and social activities. He joined the debate team, where his quiet intelligence and thoughtful arguments earned him respect from both teammates and opponents. The three former bullies became some of his most unlikely allies, their public transformation serving as an inspiration to other students who had previously engaged in similar behavior. The school's atmosphere grew noticeably more inclusive and supportive, with incidents of bullying dropping dramatically as word spread about the consequences of targeting innocent students. Elias never had to use his psychokinetic abilities again in a confrontational setting. The knowledge that he possessed such power, combined with his demonstrated restraint in using it, was enough to earn him a reputation as someone who commanded respect without demanding fear. Years later, as Elias prepared to graduate as valedictorian, he would look back on that terrifying October afternoon as the moment his real life began. The scared, hidden boy who had walked into Crestwood Academy had been transformed not by his supernatural abilities, but by his choice to use them responsibly. Standing at the podium to deliver his graduation speech, Elias looked out at an audience that included Rex, Brick, and Silas, all of whom had become genuine friends and had earned their own redemption through years of changed behavior. His message to his fellow graduates was simple but profound. True strength comes not from the power to harm others, but from the wisdom to know when not to use that power at all.